Good evening, traveler. Welcome back to this quiet corner of history, where the dust settles slowly and the hours stretch like shadows across cold stone walls. Tonight, as the world outside your window grows still and the familiar sounds of the day fade into memory, I invite you to journey with me into one of the most feared institutions of the Victorian age, a place where the line between treatment and torture blurred into nothingness, where the sane were sometimes locked away with the mad, and where escape was nearly impossible. Before we begin, I have a small request. If you are comfortable, leave a comment below telling me where you are listening from tonight and what time it is in your corner of the world. It brings me a quiet comfort to know that as I speak these words into the darkness, someone in London is watching the rain against their window. Someone in Toronto is wrapped in blankets against the cold. Someone in a small town in Ohio is listening as the house settles around them. We are all connected in this moment, scattered across time zones, but united in the simple act of seeking rest. Tonight, we will explore the Victorian Insane Asylum, that great stone edifice that haunted the imagination of an entire era. We will walk through its iron gates, pace its endless corridors, and discover what life was like for those who found themselves committed to its care. We will meet the doctors who believed they were healing, the attendants who kept order through fear, and the patients who struggled to survive in a world that had declared them unfit for society. So settle in. Adjust your pillow. Let your breathing slow. This is not a story of monsters, though monsters there were. It is a story of misunderstanding and fear, of good intentions gone terribly wrong, of a society that did not know what to do with those it could not understand. It is a story that echoes into our own time, reminding us how easily the vulnerable can be forgotten behind locked doors. Let us find our way into this darkness together and understand what it meant to be called insane in an age that was only beginning to comprehend the mysteries of the human mind. The rain falls tonight, as it fell on so many nights in Victorian England, a steady gray curtain that blurs the edges of the world and makes the darkness seem deeper than it is. In the asylum, the patients would have heard this rain against the windows, would have felt the damp seeping through the stone walls, would have pulled their thin blankets closer and tried to find warmth in a place that offered so little comfort. The rain was a companion to their suffering, a witness to their isolation, a reminder that the world outside continued without them. Close your eyes now, if you have not already. Let the sound of my voice carry you back through the years, to a time when the mad were locked away in great stone buildings, when the treatments were as likely to harm as to heal, when a diagnosis of insanity could mean a lifetime of confinement. The story we are about to explore is not easy to hear, but it is important to remember. These were real people with real lives, and their suffering should not be forgotten. In the year 1845, on a gray October morning in London, a young woman named Eleanor Blackwood sat in a carriage that rattled along cobblestone streets toward a destination she did not fully understand. She was 23 years old, the daughter of a respectable merchant, and until 6 weeks ago, she had lived a quiet life of needlework and social calls and Sunday church services. Then the dreams had started, vivid and terrifying, and the crying that she could not control, and the days when she could not rise from her bed, no matter how her mother pleaded. The doctors had come, 2 of them, with their black bags and their grave expressions. They had asked her questions she could not answer, had looked into her eyes with their little lights, had pressed their fingers to her wrists and temples. They had spoken to her father in hushed tones in the parlor below, and she had heard only fragments through the floorboards. Nervous exhaustion, melancholia, unsuitable for home care. The next morning, her trunk had been packed. Now the carriage slowed, and through the rain-streaked window, Eleanor saw it for the first time. The asylum. It rose from the ground like a fortress, 4 stories of gray stone with barred windows that reflected nothing. The central building stretched impossibly long, with wings extending on either side, like arms waiting to embrace her. A high wall surrounded the grounds, topped with iron spikes that disappeared into the low clouds. Above the main entrance, carved into stone, were words she could not quite read from this distance. The carriage passed through the main gate, which stood open, but guarded by a man in a dark uniform who watched their approach without expression. The gravel drive curved through grounds that might have been pleasant in summer, but now seemed only barren, the trees stripped of leaves, the flower beds empty, the grass brown and dying. Other buildings dotted the landscape, smaller structures whose purposes Eleanor could not guess. And in the distance she saw figures moving slowly across the grounds, supervised by attendants in white. The carriage stopped before the main entrance, and Eleanor read the words carved above the door, "For the relief of the afflicted." A man in a white coat descended the steps to meet them, his smile professional and practiced, his eyes already assessing her condition. Behind him, the door stood open, revealing a hallway that stretched into shadow. Eleanor's heart pounded against her ribs as she stepped down from the carriage. She did not know it yet, but she would not pass through those gates again for 7 years. The admission process was designed to be thorough, though in practice it often amounted to little more than paperwork and a cursory examination. Eleanor was led to a receiving room, where a clerk recorded her name, age, and the circumstances of her commitment. Her father had signed the necessary papers, and under the law of 1845, that was sufficient. 2 doctors had certified her insane, and her nearest male relative had authorized her confinement. She had no legal right to contest the decision, no opportunity to speak in her own defense. The medical superintendent appeared, a Dr. Thomas Harrington, a man of perhaps 50 with gray whiskers and spectacles that magnified his eyes into something almost owlish. He asked her questions in a gentle tone. Did she know where she was? Did she know what day it was? Did she hear voices that others could not hear? Did she see things that others could not see? Eleanor answered as best she could, her voice trembling, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She told him about the dreams, the sadness, the exhaustion that had swallowed her whole. He nodded and made notes in a leather-bound book. The physical examination came next, conducted by a younger doctor, while a female attendant stood by. Eleanor was made to undress behind a screen, her body inspected for signs of disease or self-injury. Her pulse was taken, her tongue examined, her reflexes tested. The doctor noted that she was undernourished, that her hands trembled, that her eyes were red from weeping. He wrote melancholia in the admission book, a diagnosis that would follow her for years to come. Then came the inventory of her possessions. Everything she had brought was catalogued and taken away. Her clothes, her books, her letters, the small portrait of her mother she had tucked into her trunk. She was given instead the uniform of the asylum, a plain gray dress of rough wool, undergarments that had been worn by countless women before her, shoes that did not quite fit. Her hair was examined for lice and pronounced clean, a small mercy. She was assigned a number, which would be written on all her clothing and used to identify her in the records. Finally, she was led to her ward. The female attendant, a broad woman named Mrs. Briggs, walked ahead with a ring of keys that jangled with each step. They climbed stairs and passed through locked doors, each one closing behind them with a sound that seemed to echo forever. The corridors were long and dim, lit by gas lamps that cast dancing shadows on the walls. They passed other women, some who stared, some who muttered to themselves, some who seemed not to see them at all. The smell was something Eleanor would never forget. Carbolic soap and urine and something else. Something human and desperate that no amount of cleaning could fully remove. The ward was a long room lined with iron beds, perhaps 30 of them arranged in neat rows. Each bed had a thin mattress, a single pillow, and a gray blanket folded at the foot. Between the beds were small wooden lockers, where patients could store their few permitted possessions. The walls were painted a pale green that had faded to something like the color of illness, and the windows were set high in the walls, too high to see out of. Their glass reinforced with wire mesh. Eleanor was assigned a bed near the middle of the ward, between a woman who lay motionless staring at the ceiling and another who sat on the edge of her mattress rocking back and forth, humming a tune that had no melody. Mrs. Briggs showed her where to store her things, explained the rules of the ward, and left her with instructions to rest until the dinner bell. The rules were many and strict. Patients were to rise at 6 in the morning and be in bed by 8 at night. They were to wash at the basins along the wall and use the water closets at designated times. They were to eat in the dining hall and attend chapel on Sundays. They were to participate in whatever work or activities the doctors prescribed. They were not to shout or fight or attempt to harm themselves or others. They were not to approach the windows or the doors. They were not to speak of escape. The consequences for breaking the rules were not explained, but Eleanor would learn them soon enough. She would learn about the padded cells where troublesome patients were confined in darkness. She would learn about the cold baths that were administered to calm the agitated, the straitjackets that restrained the violent, the doses of chloral hydrate that brought sleep whether the patient wanted it or not. She would learn that in this place, the doctor's word was law, and the patients had no voice at all. But on that first afternoon, she knew only that she was tired and frightened and very far from home. She lay down on the narrow bed and pulled the gray blanket over herself and closed her eyes. Around her, the sounds of the ward continued. The humming woman, the coughing from somewhere down the row, the footsteps of attendants on their rounds. Outside, the rain continued to fall, and the gray afternoon faded slowly into a gray evening. And Eleanor Blackwood began her first night in the asylum. The mattress beneath her was thin, stuffed with horsehair that had compressed over years of use into something that offered little cushion against the iron frame. The pillow smelled of carbolic soap and something else, something human and institutional that she would eventually stop noticing. The blanket was wool, rough against her skin, inadequate against the chill that seemed to seep from the very walls. She did not sleep that first night. She lay with her eyes closed, listening to the sounds of the ward, trying to make sense of this new world she had entered. The humming woman hummed on, her tune rising and falling without pattern or purpose. Somewhere in the darkness, someone wept quietly, the sound muffled as if she were trying to hide it. Footsteps passed in the corridor outside, the jangling of keys marking each passage of the attendants on their rounds. The hours stretched endlessly. She heard the clock tower strike midnight, then 1, then 2. She heard the sounds of the night shift changing, new voices in the corridor, new footsteps on the stairs. She heard the screaming start somewhere in the distance, a sound that rose to a peak and then cut off suddenly, replaced by a silence that was somehow worse than the noise had been got by the time the gray light of dawn began to filter through the high windows. Eleanor had not slept at all. Her eyes were gritty, her body ached from lying still on the hard mattress, and her mind was numb with exhaustion and fear. But the bell was ringing now, the morning bell that summoned patients from their beds, and there was no time for rest. Her first full day in the asylum was about to begin. The Victorian asylum was not built by accident or without thought. It was the product of a philosophy, a belief that the mad could be cured, or at least managed, through the proper application of architecture and routine. The great asylum builders of the 19th century designed their institutions according to principles that seemed enlightened at the time, principles of light and air and order that were meant to soothe the troubled mind and guide it back to reasoned out. The typical asylum followed a pattern that had been established in the 1830s and 1840s, when the great wave of asylum construction swept across Britain and America. The main building was often designed in a style called the Kirkbride Plan, named after the American physician Thomas Story Kirkbride, who had popularized it. This plan called for a central administration building flanked by wings that extended outward in a shallow V-shape. Like the wings of a bird preparing for flight, the central building housed the superintendent's office, the admission rooms, and often the superintendent's own residence. The wings were divided into wards, with the less disturbed patients housed closest to the center, and the more disturbed patients relegated to the outer reaches. This arrangement was meant to serve both practical and therapeutic purposes. It allowed for efficient supervision, while also providing a kind of moral hierarchy, with patients supposedly motivated to improve their behavior in order to move closer to the center and eventually to freedom. The buildings were massive, often stretching for hundreds of feet, with multiple stories and hundreds of rooms. They were built to be impressive, to project an image of strength and permanence that would reassure the public and perhaps intimidate the patients into compliance. The architecture drew on various historical styles, from Gothic Revival to Italianate to Tudor, but always with an emphasis on symmetry and order. The message was clear. This was a place of discipline, where chaos would be contained and madness brought under control. The windows of the asylum told a story of their own. On the lower floors, where patients were housed, the windows were set high in the walls and fitted with bars or wire mesh. This was officially to prevent escape and to protect patients from self-harm, but it also meant that patients could not see the outside world, could not watch the seasons change or the people passing by. They lived in a kind of twilight, aware that there was a world beyond the walls, but unable to connect with it. On the upper floors, where the administrative offices and the superintendent's quarters were located, the windows were larger and unbarred, offering views of the grounds and the countryside beyond. The doctors and their families could look out at the gardens and the farms that supplied the asylum's food, could watch the patients taking their supervised exercise, could see visitors arriving and departing. The architecture itself encoded the hierarchy of the institution, Those in charge had access to light and views, while those confined had only walls and shadows. The walls were thick, built of stone or brick, designed to contain sound as well as bodies. A patient screaming in one ward might not be heard in the next, and the sounds of the outside world barely penetrated at all. This isolation was both physical and psychological, cutting patients off from everything familiar and surrounding them with an environment that was entirely controlled by the institution. Even the colors were chosen to suppress excitement. Pale greens and grays and creams, nothing bright or stimulating. Nothing that might provoke the already troubled mind. The grounds outside the walls were often extensive, encompassing farms and gardens and workshops where patients could labor under supervision. The asylum was designed to be self-sufficient, producing much of its own food and manufacturing many of its own supplies. This served an economic purpose, reducing the cost of maintaining the institution, but it also served a therapeutic one, or so the doctors believed. Work was considered essential to recovery, a way of occupying the mind and body that might otherwise turn inward and feed upon itself. Inside the asylum was marked by sound, or rather by particular sounds that punctuated the long silences. There was the jangling of keys, that endless metallic music that announced the approach of attendants and the opening and closing of doors. There was the clanking of the heating pipes, the great iron arteries that carried steam through the building and radiated warmth that was never quite enough. There was the shuffling of feet on stone floors, the coughing and muttering of patients, the distant clatter from the kitchens and laundries. And there was screaming. Not constantly, not everywhere, but often enough that patients learned to expect it, to steel themselves against it, to pretend they did not hear. The screams came from the refractory wards, where the most disturbed patients were housed, or from the treatment rooms where procedures were carried out, or simply from somewhere in the labyrinth of corridors where someone had lost the battle against whatever demons pursued them. New patients found the screaming terrifying. Long-term patients learned to hear it as simply another sound of the institution. No more remarkable than the chapel bell's dot, the silences were harder to bear. At night, when the gas lamps were turned down and the patients were meant to be sleeping, the asylum fell into a quiet that was not peace. It was the quiet of dozens of people lying awake in the darkness, each alone with their thoughts, each listening to the breathing and stirring of the others. It was the quiet of footsteps passing in the corridor, of keys turning in locks, of doors opening and closing on unknown errands. It was the quiet of an institution that never fully slept, where someone was always watching, always waiting. Eleanor Blackwood learned these sounds in her first weeks at the asylum. She learned which footsteps belonged to which attendants, learned to distinguish the sound of the dinner bell from the sound of the alarm that meant a patient had become violent. She learned that the quiet hours after supper were the safest, that the early morning hours were when the screaming was worst, that Sundays brought a different rhythm with chapel services and visiting hours. She learned to navigate the asylum by sound as much as by sight, her ears always alert for the signals that told her what was happening and what might happen next. At the apex of the asylum hierarchy stood the medical superintendent, a figure of almost absolute authority within the institution's walls. He was responsible for the care and treatment of all patients, for the management of the staff, for the finances of the institution, and for its reputation in the wider world. He reported to a board of governors or commissioners, but in practice, he had enormous discretion in how he ran his asylum. and the board rarely interfered with his decisions. Dr. Thomas Harrington, the superintendent of the asylum where Eleanor Blackwood found herself confined, was by the standards of his time a progressive man. He had trained at Edinburgh and spent time at several continental institutions before taking up his post. He believed in what was called moral treatment, a philosophy that emphasized kindness and routine over restraint and punishment. He had abolished the use of chains in his asylum and limited the use of mechanical restraints to cases of extreme necessity. He took pride in the cleanliness of his wards, the quality of the food served to patients, the programs of work and recreation that occupied their days. Yet even a progressive superintendent operated within constraints that made true reform impossible. The asylum was overcrowded, designed for 300 patients, but housing nearly 500. The staff was insufficient, a handful of doctors, and a few dozen attendants responsible for hundreds of troubled souls. The budget was limited, forcing economies in food and clothing and heating that made the patients' lives harder than they needed to be. And the medical knowledge of the time was simply inadequate to the task of understanding, let alone treating. The conditions that brought people to the asylum. Dr. Harrington made his rounds each morning, walking through the wards with an entourage of junior doctors and attendants, stopping at each bed to inquire about the patient's condition, to ask questions, to prescribe treatments. For most patients, these brief encounters were the only contact they had with a physician, the only moment when someone in authority acknowledged their existence and their suffering. The superintendent moved quickly, efficiently, his attention already shifting to the next patient before he had finished with the current one. There were too many patients and too little time, and the rounds that were meant to be therapeutic had become instead a kind of institutional ritual, meaningful more for what they represented than for what they accomplished. The treatments offered to patients in Victorian asylums ranged from the benign to the brutal, though the doctors who administered them believed they were acting in the patient's best interests. The fundamental problem was that the causes of mental illness were unknown, and the treatments were therefore based on theory rather than evidence. Different doctors favored different approaches, and patients might be subjected to radically different regimens, depending on which institution they entered, and which physician took charge of their case. The most common treatment was simply confinement itself. The asylum was meant to remove patients from the stresses and temptations of the outside world, to place them in an environment of order and routine where their minds could heal. Work was prescribed, not for punishment, but for therapy. Patients tended gardens, worked in laundries, sewed clothing, performed the countless tasks necessary to keep the institution running. Exercise was considered essential, and patients were taken for supervised walks around the grounds, weather permitting. Religious services were held regularly, for the health of the soul was thought to be connected to the health of the mind. But for patients who did not improve under this regime, more aggressive treatments were available. The cold bath was a common intervention, based on the theory that sudden shock could jolt the mind out of its disordered state. Patients were immersed in cold water, sometimes for hours at a time, their heads held above the surface, while their bodies shivered and convulsed. Warm baths were also used for their supposed calming effects, with patients kept in the water until they became limp and compliant. Mechanical restraints remained common despite the reform movements of the early 19th century. The straitjacket was the most famous, a canvas garment that pinned the patient's arms to their body. But there were many other devices: the restraint chair, which held the patient immobile in a seated position. The crib bed, an enclosed wooden structure that prevented the patient from rising or moving. Leather straps and manacles that attached to beds or walls. These restraints were meant to prevent patients from harming themselves or others. But they were also used as punishment for misbehavior and as a convenience for understaffed wards. The pharmacopoeia of the Victorian asylum was limited but potent. The doctors had few drugs at their disposal, but those they had were used liberally, often in combinations and dosages that would horrify modern physicians. The goal was usually sedation, the quieting of the agitated patient, the suppression of symptoms that the doctors could not otherwise address. Chloral hydrate was the workhorse of asylum medicine, a sedative that could be given in liquid form and that produced deep sleep within half an hour. It was used for patients who could not sleep, for patients who were agitated or violent, for patients who simply needed to be kept quiet while the understaffed wards carried on their routines. The drug was addictive, and patients who received it regularly developed tolerance, requiring ever larger doses to achieve the same effect. Overdoses were not uncommon, and some patients died from the drug that was meant to help them. Morphine was used for similar purposes, particularly for patients whose disturbance was accompanied by physical pain. It was injected beneath the skin or given in liquid form, and it produced a dreamy state of calm that the doctors interpreted as improvement. Like chloral hydrate, morphine was addictive, and patients sometimes left the asylum with a dependency they had not had when they entered. The connection between the drug and the addiction was not fully understood, and doctors continued to prescribe morphine freely, believing they were relieving suffering rather than creating new problems. Bromides were prescribed for epileptic patients, and for those whose conditions were thought to involve excessive nervous excitement. These salts had a calming effect, but they also accumulated in the body, causing a condition called bromism that produced confusion, tremors, and skin eruptions. Patients on long-term bromide therapy often deteriorated rather than improved, their original symptoms masked but replaced by new ones caused by the treatment itself. And there were other drugs, other treatments, other interventions that the doctors tried in their attempts to cure the incurable. Purgatives to cleanse the system, tonics to build strength, blistering agents applied to the skin to draw out supposed toxins, leeches and bloodletting, remnants of an older medicine that had not yet completely disappeared. The patients submitted to these treatments because they had no choice, because the doctors believed in them, because there was always hope that something might help. Often, nothing did. The treatment rooms were located in a separate wing of the asylum, away from the main wards, where the sounds of procedures being administered would not disturb the other patients. Eleanor learned to dread the summons to this wing, the attendant appearing at her bedside with the words that meant her presence was required. She never knew what awaited her, what new intervention the doctors had decided to try, what new assault on her body they had prescribed. The examination room was cold and clinical. White tiles on the walls and floor, a high table covered in leather where patients were made to lie. The instruments were arranged on a metal tray, gleaming in the gaslight, their purposes mysterious and threatening. The doctors moved around her with professional detachment, discussing her case as if she were not there, as if she were simply a body to be treated rather than a person to be consulted. She learned to dissociate during these procedures, to send her mind elsewhere while her body endured whatever was being done to it. She thought of her mother's garden, of the roses that bloomed each summer, of the smell of cut grass and the sound of bees. She thought of books she had read, stories that had transported her to other worlds, heroines who had faced their trials with courage. She thought of anything except the cold hands on her skin, the instruments probing her body, the voices discussing her condition in terms she did not understand. The worst part was not the pain, though there was pain. The worst part was the helplessness, the knowledge that she had no say in what was done to her, that her body belonged to the institution and could be used as the doctor saw fit. She was not a person here. She was a patient, a case, a collection of symptoms to be treated. Her wishes, her fears, her dignity, none of these mattered. Only the diagnosis mattered, and the treatment, and the hope that somehow, eventually, she would be cured. The day in the asylum began at 6 o'clock, when the morning bell echoed through the wards and the attendants began rousing the patients from their beds. There was no gentle awakening, no time to lie in the warmth of the blankets and gather one's thoughts. The patients were expected to be up immediately, to strip their beds and fold their blankets and stand ready for inspection. Those who did not rise quickly enough might find their blankets pulled away, or a cold, wet cloth pressed to their faces, or the sharp voice of an attendant threatening consequences. The washing came next. Patients lined up at the basins along the wall, where tepid water waited in metal containers. Soap was distributed sparingly, a small piece that had to last the week. The patients washed their faces and hands under the watchful eyes of the attendants, who checked for cleanliness and noted any signs of self-injury or illness. There was no privacy, no modesty possible in these communal ablutions. The body belonged to the institution as much as the mind did. Dressing followed washing. Patients put on the same clothes they had worn the day before, the rough gray dresses or trousers that marked them as inmates. Once a week, on Saturday, clean clothes were distributed, and the dirty ones collected for the laundry. The clothes were not assigned to individual patients, but were shared among the ward. So a patient might wear a different size each week, might find herself in clothes that were too large or too small, or stained in ways that suggested previous owners she preferred not to imagine. Then the meds had to be made, the ward tidied, the floors swept. Patients who were capable were assigned to these tasks, while those who were not sat or stood or wandered in whatever space was available. The attendants supervised, corrected, occasionally punished patients who did not meet their standards or who moved too slowly. By 7 o'clock, the ward was expected to be ready for inspection by the charge attendant, who walked between the beds checking for proper corners. Smooth blankets, swept floors. Breakfast was served at 7:30, in a dining hall large enough to accommodate the entire ward. The patients filed in and took their assigned seats at long wooden tables, and the food was brought out in large containers, from which it was ladled into individual bowls or plates. The meal was always the same: porridge, sometimes with a small portion of treacle or molasses, and tea or coffee that was more water than anything else. Bread was served, a single slice per patient, and occasionally a scraping of margarine. The patients ate in silence, or what passed for silence in a room full of troubled minds. Some ate quickly, hungrily, having learned that food not consumed might be taken away. Others picked at their portions, their appetites destroyed by illness or medication or despair. Still others could not eat at all, their minds so disordered that they had forgotten how. And these patients were fed by attendants who spooned the porridge into their mouths with practiced efficiency. The midday meal was the largest of the day. usually a stew or soup with vegetables from the asylum's gardens and meat that was more gristle than flesh. Potatoes were common, as was bread, and on good days there might be a small portion of pudding for dessert. The evening meal was lighter, often just bread and cheese and tea, with perhaps some cold meat left from dinner. The food was never good, but it was regular, and for some patients it was better than what they had known on the outside. The meals served another purpose beyond nutrition. They were a point of structure in the day, a fixed moment around which the rest of the routine revolved. They gave patients something to anticipate, something to mark the passage of time, something to break the monotony of the hours. And they brought patients together in a communal activity, however grim. That was one of the few social experiences the asylum allowed. The hours between meals were filled with activity, or what passed for activity in the asylum. Patients who were capable were assigned to work details, not as punishment, but as therapy. The doctors believed that work was essential to recovery, that an occupied mind was less likely to dwell on its disorders, that the habits of industry would prepare patients for eventual return to society. And there was also a practical consideration. The asylum needed labor to function, and patients provided a workforce that cost nothing beyond their keep. Women worked in the laundry, standing at great tubs of hot water and lye soap, scrubbing the endless stream of sheets and clothes and towels that the institution produced. They worked in the kitchens, peeling vegetables and washing dishes, and carrying heavy pots from stove to table. They sewed and mended, repairing the asylum's linens and making the simple garments that patients wore. They cleaned the wards, swept the corridors, polished the brass fixtures that were one of the superintendent's particular obsessions. Men worked on the grounds, tending the gardens and farms that supplied the asylum's food. They worked in the workshops, making furniture and shoes and 1,000 other items the institution needed. They stoked the boilers that heated the buildings and carried coal from the storage sheds to the furnaces. They worked on construction and maintenance, repairing the endless deterioration of buildings that housed hundreds of people in conditions that no building could long withstand. For patients too ill to work, the long afternoon offered only waiting. They sat in the day rooms, spaces furnished with hard chairs, and a few tables where they could read or write or play simple games. But there were few books and fewer games, and many patients simply sat, staring at the walls or the floor or into some distance that only they could see. The attendants watched, intervened when necessary, but had little time for the kind of individual attention that might have made a difference. The hours passed slowly, each minute indistinguishable from the next. The day room was a large space at the end of the ward, with windows that let in whatever light the English weather permitted. The furniture was heavy and institutional, designed to withstand abuse rather than to provide comfort. The chairs were arranged along the walls, leaving the center of the room empty, a space that patients crossed but did not occupy. A fireplace provided some warmth in winter, though the coal allocation was never generous enough to make the room truly comfortable. Eleanor spent many afternoons in this room, sitting in the same chair by the same window, watching the same view of the grounds below. She saw the seasons change through that window, saw the leaves fall and the snow accumulate in the first tentative green of spring. She watched patients walking in the gardens, supervised by attendants, taking their prescribed exercise. She watched delivery wagons come and go, bringing supplies from the outside world. She watched visitors arrive for their monthly appointments, their carriages elegant against the gray stone of the asylum. The boredom was crushing, a weight that pressed down on the mind and made thought difficult. There was nothing to do, nothing to look forward to, nothing to distinguish one day from another. The same meals at the same times, the same faces in the same places, the same conversations repeated until they lost all meaning. Some patients found ways to occupy themselves, making up games or telling stories or simply talking to hear the sound of human voices. Others retreated into silence, into worlds inside their heads that no one else could enter. Reading was permitted for patients who demonstrated appropriate behavior, and Eleanor took full advantage of this privilege. The asylum library was small and poorly stocked, its shelves filled with improving works of religion and morality that someone had thought suitable for the mad. But there were also novels, donated by well-meaning visitors, and Eleanor read them all, losing herself in stories of love and adventure that were as far from her present circumstances as she could get. The books were her escape, her connection to the world she had lost, her reminder that there was more to life than the walls that surrounded her. Writing was also permitted, though paper and ink were strictly rationed, and all correspondence was read by the staff before being sent. Eleanor wrote to her family regularly, letters that said little, because she knew they would be read, letters that spoke of hope and progress, because that was what she was expected to say. She did not write about the treatments or the food or the conditions of the ward. She did not write about her fears or her despair or her growing conviction that she would never leave. She wrote what she was supposed to write, and she waited for responses that came less and less frequently. The patients of the Victorian asylum came from all walks of life and arrived for reasons as varied as human suffering itself. Some were genuinely ill, suffering from conditions that we would now recognize as schizophrenia or bipolar disorder or severe depression. Others were simply inconvenient, committed by families who did not know what else to do with relatives, who could not or would not conform to social expectations. The line between madness and eccentricity was never clearly drawn, and the asylum received many who belonged on one side or the other of that uncertain boundary. Women were committed for conditions that might raise no alarm today. Puerperal insanity, the mental disturbance that sometimes followed childbirth, filled the asylum wards with new mothers whose families could not cope with their symptoms. Hysteria, that catch-all diagnosis for female complaints, justified the commitment of women who were anxious or depressed or simply unhappy with their circumstances. Masturbation was considered a cause of insanity in both men and women, and patients were sometimes committed for this supposed sin alone. Moral insanity, a diagnosis that covered behavior society found unacceptable, brought in patients whose only crime was being different. Men were committed for similar reasons, though the particular diagnosis differed. Alcoholism brought many to the asylum, their families hoping that confinement would achieve the sobriety that will alone could not. General paresis of the insane, the mental deterioration caused by untreated syphilis, filled entire wards with men whose earlier indiscretions had caught up with them decades later. Mania and melancholia, those ancient categories of mental disturbance, applied to men who were too energetic or too listless for the society that surrounded them. Some patients arrived at the asylum through the criminal justice system, transferred from prisons where their behavior had proven too disturbed for even that harsh environment. Some came from workhouses, where the destitute mentally ill had been warehoused until the asylum system expanded to receive them. Some came directly from the streets, picked up by police and brought to the asylum as a matter of public order. And a few, came voluntarily, seeking help for suffering they could no longer bear alone. For many patients, admission to the asylum was meant to be temporary, a brief period of treatment and recovery before return to family and community. The reality was often different. Some patients did recover and were discharged, their symptoms resolved or managed well enough that they could function outside the institution's walls. But many did not recover, or recovered only to relapse, or were simply never retrieved by families who had moved on without them. The long-term residents of the asylum formed a community of their own, a population that had adapted to institutional life and could no longer imagine any other. They knew the routines by heart, knew which attendants were kind and which were cruel, knew the best places to sit and the best ways to avoid trouble. They had formed friendships and enmities, had established hierarchies and alliances, had created a social world within the walls that excluded them from the larger one. Some long-term patients became workers in all but name, assigned to tasks that the asylum could not function without. They worked in the kitchens and laundries, in the gardens and workshops, earning no wages but receiving small privileges in return. They were allowed extra food, or better clothing, or access to rooms that other patients could not enter. They became part of the institution's staff in everything but title, trusted more than new patients, but never as much as the attendants who held the keys. Others deteriorated over the years, their conditions worsening rather than improving, their minds and bodies wearing down under the weight of institutional life. The chronic wards housed patients who no longer spoke, who no longer recognized their own names, who had retreated so far into their illnesses that nothing could reach them. They were kept clean and fed and alive, but no one expected them to recover. They would remain in the asylum until they died, and they would be buried in the asylum cemetery, their graves marked with numbers rather than names. Eleanor Blackwood came to know her fellow patients gradually, learning their stories through fragments of conversation and observation. In the bed next to hers slept Margaret, a woman of perhaps 40 who had been in the asylum for 15 years. Margaret rarely spoke, but when she did, she talked about her children, 3 daughters she had not seen since her commitment, and who had grown up without her. She had been brought to the asylum after the death of her husband, when her grief had overwhelmed her and her in-laws had decided she was unfit to raise the girls. Across the ward was Alice, who believed that she was the Queen of England and treated everyone around her with the gracious condescension of royalty. Alice had been a governess before her commitment, an educated woman who had read too many books and imagined too many possibilities. Her delusion was harmless, even charming in its way, but it was enough to keep her confined year after year. Her fantasy of royalty, the only crown she would ever wear. There was Sarah, who heard voices that told her to do terrible things, and who fought against them with a courage that few recognized. There was Jane, who had simply stopped speaking one day and had not uttered a word in 7 years. There was Bessie, who laughed at nothing and everything, her merriment a symptom of a disorder that no one could name. There was old Mrs. Patterson, who had been in the asylum for 30 years and who remembered a time before the current superintendent, before the current building, before the current rules. These women became Eleanor's companions, her community, her reference points in a world that had lost all other landmarks. She learned their habits and their triggers, learned when to offer comfort and when to keep her distance, learned the particular madness of each and the particular humanity that the madness could not quite obscure. They were not friends, exactly, for friendship requires a freedom that the asylum did not allow. But they were something, a network of connection that made the isolation bearable. There were others, too, whose stories Eleanor learned over the months and years of her confinement. Catherine, who had been a teacher before her commitment, and who still tried to educate the other patients, sharing what she knew of history and literature and mathematics with anyone who would listen. Her mind was clear, and her speech was coherent. But she had been committed by a brother who wanted control of their family's estate, and no amount of rational behavior could secure her release. There was Ruth, who had come to the asylum as a child and had never known any other life. She was now in her 30s, a woman who had grown up within these walls, who knew nothing of the world outside, who would not have known how to survive if she had been released. The asylum was her home, the only home she had ever had, and she spoke of it with a kind of affection that Eleanor found both touching and horrifying. There was Emily, who believed that she was dead, that her body had died years ago, and only her spirit remained, trapped in a world she no longer belonged to. She ate and drank and performed all the functions of life, but she insisted that these were meaningless gestures, that she was a ghost going through the motions of existence. The doctors called her condition melancholia with delusions, but Eleanor thought it sounded more like poetry, a metaphor for how the asylum made them all feel. And there was Helena, the closest thing Eleanor had to a true friend. Helena had been committed for reasons she would not discuss, but she was clearly intelligent, clearly sane, clearly trapped by circumstances beyond her control. She and Eleanor talked for hours in the day room, sharing memories of the lives they had lost, speculating about the futures they might have, creating between them a small space of normalcy in the midst of institutional madness. Helena was released in Eleanor's 3rd year, her family finally convinced to take her back. The 2 women said goodbye in the visiting room, both of them knowing that they would never see each other again. Helena promised to write, but the letters never came, and Eleanor was left to wonder whether her friend had found happiness in the outside world or whether the silence meant something darker. The loss of Helena was one of the hardest things Eleanor endured, a reminder that connection in the asylum was always temporary, always subject to forces beyond her control. Asterisk, the attendants were the true rulers of the asylum, the ones who translated the doctor's orders into daily reality and who controlled every aspect of the patients' lives. They held the keys that opened and closed the doors. They decided when patients could eat, sleep, wash, walk, rest. They administered the medications and the treatments, applied the restraints, reported on behavior good and bad. For most patients, the attendants were the face of the institution, the only staff they interacted with on a regular basis. The job attracted a certain type of person. The pay was poor, the hours long, the work unpleasant, and sometimes dangerous. Attendants were recruited from the working class, men and women who had few other options, and who accepted the position because it offered steady employment and a roof over their heads. Many lived on the asylum grounds, in dormitories or small cottages, their lives as circumscribed in their way as the patients' lives were in theirs. The work hardened them. Day after day of dealing with the disturbed and the violent, the incontinent and the suicidal, the manipulative and the withdrawn, took its toll. Attendants who began with compassion often lost it, replaced by a protective callousness that allowed them to do their jobs without being destroyed by them. They learned to see patients not as individuals, but as problems to be managed, symptoms to be suppressed, bodies to be fed and cleaned and confined. Some attendants were genuinely cruel, taking pleasure in the power they held over helpless people, punishing patients for infractions real and imagined. They struck patients who annoyed them, withheld food from those who did not obey quickly enough, applied restraints not because they were necessary, but because they could. The asylum administration officially condemned such behavior, but it was difficult to detect and difficult to prove. And attendants who brought order to their wards were rarely questioned about their methods. Mrs. Briggs, the attendant who had received Eleanor on her first day, was neither the best nor the worst of her kind. She had worked in the asylum for 12 years, rising from the lowest rank to become the charge attendant of Eleanor's ward. She was efficient, knowledgeable, and generally fair in her treatment of patients, though she was not above using harsh measures when she deemed them necessary. She woke the patients each morning with a brisk efficiency that left no room for complaint. She supervised the washing and dressing, the meals and the work, the medications and the treatments. She kept order in the ward through a combination of routine, vigilance, and the implicit threat of consequences that patients learned not to test. She knew each patient's history, each patient's triggers, each patient's place in the complex hierarchy of the ward. Mrs. Briggs had seen everything in her 12 years. She had seen patients recover and leave, had seen patients decline and die. She had been attacked by patients in the grip of their delusions, had restrained patients who were trying to harm themselves, had sat with patients in their final hours when no family came to claim them. The work had worn grooves in her soul, patterns of response that no longer required thought or feeling. But there were moments when something else showed through. A word of encouragement to a patient who is struggling, a small kindness, an extra blanket on a cold night, a few minutes of conversation when the ward was quiet. Mrs. Briggs was not a monster, however much the patients might sometimes think so. She was a woman doing a hard job in a hard place, shaped by circumstances that offered few alternatives. In another life, she might have been something else entirely. Violence was a constant presence in the asylum, lurking beneath the surface of daily routine and erupting without warning. Patients attacked attendants. Attendants retaliated against patients. Patients turned on each other in conflicts that the crowded wards made inevitable. The violence was rarely reported, rarely investigated, rarely punished. It was simply part of life in an institution where troubled minds were crowded together under conditions that would have strained anyone's sanity. The attendants were authorized to use physical force to restrain violent patients, and the definition of violence was elastic enough to cover almost any behavior they found objectionable. A patient who refused to eat might be forced. A patient who refused to take medication might be held down while it was administered. A patient who spoke back to an attendant might find herself in a struggle that ended with bruises and a night in the padded cell. The patients fought back when they could, with whatever means they had. They bit and scratched and kicked. They threw things, whatever came to hand. They attacked without warning, driven by delusions or simply by rage at their confinement. The attendants wore the marks of these attacks, the scars and bruises that came with the job, and they learned to be always on guard, always ready for the sudden explosion of violence that could come from any direction. Eleanor, witnessed the violence, but was rarely its target or its perpetrator. She learned to stay quiet, to comply with orders, to make herself invisible when tensions rose. She learned to recognize the signs that preceded an outburst, the particular quality of silence, the tension in the air, and to move away from the coming storm. She survived by becoming small, by becoming still, by becoming nothing that would attract attention or provoke response. Despite the reform movements that had swept through asylum care in the early 19th century, mechanical restraints remained a common feature of institutional life. The straitjacket was the most notorious, a canvas garment that wrapped around the torso and pinned the arms to the body, but there were many other devices designed to control and confine. The restraint chair held patients immobile in a seated position, their arms and legs strapped to the frame. The crib bed was an enclosed wooden structure, like a coffin with a lid, that prevented any movement at all. The official position was that restraints should be used only when absolutely necessary, only for the shortest possible time, only under medical supervision. The reality was different. Attendants applied restraints for their own convenience, to quiet troublesome patients so they could attend to other duties, to punish misbehavior, to assert control. Patients might spend hours or days in restraints, their muscles cramping, their circulation impaired, their dignity stripped away along with their freedom of movement. The experience of being restrained was terrifying in ways that those who have not undergone it cannot fully understand. To be bound, helpless, unable to move or defend oneself, was to be reduced to something less than human. Patients in restraints often became more agitated rather than less, their panic and rage building as they struggled against bonds that would not yield. The restraints that were meant to calm them only deepened their distress, creating a cycle of violence and confinement that could go on indefinitely. Eleanor was restrained only once, after an incident that she would remember for the rest of her life. She had been in the asylum for 3 months, and the depression that had brought her there had begun to lift, replaced by a restless energy that she could not control. She had argued with an attendant, had raised her voice, had refused to return to her bed when ordered. Within minutes, she found herself on the floor, held down by 2 attendants, while a third wrapped her in the canvas embrace of the straitjacket. The cold bath was considered a therapeutic intervention, a way of shocking the system out of its disordered state. The theory was that the sudden cold would stimulate the nerves, would redirect the blood flow, would somehow jolt the mind back to proper functioning. The practice was simpler. A patient was immersed in cold water and kept there until she became compliant or until the attendants decided she had had enough. The bathroom was in the basement of the asylum, a tiled chamber with several large tubs and a pervasive smell of damp and mildew. Patients were brought there by attendants, stripped of their clothing, and lowered into water that came straight from the pump, cold enough to steal the breath and set the teeth chattering. Some patients were held in the water for minutes, others for hours. Some were dunked repeatedly, pulled out just long enough to gasp for air, before being pushed under again. The effects of the cold bath were dramatic and immediate. The body went into shock, the muscles tensing, the heart racing, the mind focusing entirely on the overwhelming sensation of cold. Patients emerged from the bath shaking and exhausted, their agitation replaced by a dull compliance that the doctors interpreted as improvement. The treatment was repeated as often as the doctors deemed necessary, daily for some patients, weekly for others. Whenever the staff decided that a patient needed calming down, Eleanor underwent the cold bath twice during her years in the asylum. The first time was after her episode with the straitjacket, when the doctors decided that her newfound energy was a sign of mania that needed to be suppressed. She was taken to the basement, undressed by female attendants, and lowered into water so cold it seemed to burn. She screamed, thrashed, begged for release, but the attendants held her firmly until the doctor gave the signal that she could be removed. She did not argue with attendants again for a very long time. Asterisk, asterisk. Not all treatment in the asylum was harsh or punitive. The philosophy of moral treatment, which had originated in the early 19th century, emphasized kindness, routine, and the therapeutic power of a structured environment. Patients were to be treated with respect, engaged in useful work, provided with recreation and religious services, and gradually guided back to reason through the example of orderly living. In practice, moral treatment meant different things in different institutions and to different doctors. At its best, it meant that patients were housed in clean, well-lit wards, fed adequate meals, given opportunities for work and recreation, and treated with basic human dignity. At its worst, it meant simply that the institution claimed to follow enlightened principles while continuing practices that were anything but enlightened. The asylum where Eleanor was confined made some effort at moral treatment. There were weekly dances in the Great Hall, where patients and staff mingled in a carefully supervised approximation of normal social life. There were concerts and theatrical performances put on by patients with the help of staff and attended by visitors who came to see how the reformed asylum operated. There was a library, small and poorly stocked, but available to patients who could demonstrate responsible behavior. There were walks on the grounds, supervised but outdoors, a taste of freedom within the confines of the walls. But these amenities were unevenly distributed. Patients in the better wards, those who were judged less disturbed and more likely to recover, had access to privileges that patients in the back wards never saw. The chronic patients, the ones who had been in the asylum for years and showed no sign of improvement, were warehoused in conditions that mocked the principles of moral treatment. The asylum was two institutions in one, a showcase of enlightened care for those who might leave, and a repository of forgotten souls for those who never would. Time in the asylum moved differently than time in the outside world. The days were structured, predictable, each one almost indistinguishable from the one before. The bells rang at the same hours. The meals were served at the same times. The routines repeated with numbing regularity. For patients who had come from lives of variety and change, this sameness was itself a kind of torture, a flattening of experience that made it impossible to remember what had happened when. The seasons offered the only real markers of time's passage. In spring, the grounds came alive with flowers planted by patient laborers, and the air that came through the high windows smelled of growing things rather than carbolic soap. In summer, the wards grew hot and stifling, the patients listless and irritable, the attendants short-tempered and quick to punish. In autumn, the leaves changed color and fell, and patients watched from behind barred windows as the world prepared for winter. In winter, the cold crept through the stone walls, and the heating system labored to keep the wards barely warm enough for survival. Eleanor marked her time by the seasons, counting the springs that came and went, the summers that dragged on, the autumns that brought a kind of melancholy beauty, the winters that seemed to last forever. She had entered the asylum in October, and each October she counted another year. 1 year, then 2, then 3. The outside world continued without her, but she had no way of knowing what changes it had seen. Her family wrote sometimes, brief letters that told her little and asked for nothing. The visits grew less frequent, then stopped altogether. The anniversaries were the hardest times. The anniversary of her admission, when she remembered the carriage ride and the first sight of the gates. The anniversary of her birthday, which passed unmarked by the institution and celebrated, if at all, only in her own mind. The anniversary of her mother's death, which had occurred 2 years into her confinement, and which she had learned about through a letter from her father. Too late to attend the funeral, too late to say goodbye. Other patients marked their own anniversaries, their own private calendars of loss and longing. Margaret counted the birthdays of her daughters, imagining them growing up without her, wondering if they remembered her at all. Alice celebrated the anniversary of her coronation, a delusion that gave her joy, even as it kept her confined. Old Mrs. Patterson marked the death of her husband 35 years ago now, though sometimes she forgot how long it had been and spoke of him as if he had died only yesterday. The institution did not recognize these private anniversaries, did not acknowledge the personal histories that patients brought with them and carried through their years of confinement. To the asylum, patients were cases, not individuals, their identities reduced to diagnoses and case numbers. The anniversaries were reminders of the selves that patients had been before they entered, the lives they had lived, the people they had loved. They were threads connecting past to present, fragile but persistent. Evidence that the patients had once been something other than what the institution said they were, despite the sameness of daily routine. Things did change in the asylum, slowly, almost imperceptibly. Patients came and went, some discharged as recovered, some transferred to other institutions, some dying and being buried in the cemetery beyond the walls. Staff changed too, attendants leaving for better positions or simply burning out, doctors arriving with new ideas or departing for private practice. Even the buildings changed, expanded and renovated to accommodate the ever-growing population of the mad. Eleanor watched these changes from her fixed position in the ward. She saw new patients arrive with the same terror she had felt, watched them adjust or fail to adjust, saw some leave and others settle into the long-term residency that had become her own fate. She saw attendants come and go, some better than others, none of them quite human to her anymore, just figures of authority who controlled her days. She saw the ward repainted, saw the beds rearranged, saw small improvements that changed nothing essential. She changed too, though it was harder to see. The depression that had brought her to the asylum had long since lifted, replaced by something that was not quite health, but was not quite illness either. She had adapted to institutional life, had learned its rhythms and its rules, had become part of its fabric in ways that made the outside world seem increasingly unreal. She was no longer the young woman who had arrived in the carriage 7 years ago. She was something else now, something shaped by the asylum, something that might not survive beyond its walls. The woman she had been seemed like a stranger now, someone she had known long ago, but could no longer fully recall. That woman had had hopes and dreams, had imagined a future of marriage and children, and a home of her own. That woman had read novels and attended parties, and worried about whether her dress was fashionable enough, concerns that seemed absurd from the perspective of the asylum. That woman had been innocent, had not known that the world contained places like this, had not imagined that her life could change so completely and so quickly. Asterisk, asterisk, the woman she had become was harder, quieter, more watchful. She had learned to hide her feelings, to show the attendants only compliance and docility, to keep her true thoughts locked away where no one could examine them and find evidence of madness. She had learned to expect nothing, to hope for nothing, to take each day as it came without looking too far ahead or too far behind. She had become, in some ways, exactly what the asylum wanted her to become: a manageable patient, a cooperative inmate, a body that could be fed and housed and controlled without causing trouble. But there was something else, too, something that had not been there before. She had survived. She had endured 7 years of confinement, 7 years of treatments and routines and degradations, and she was still here, still herself, still able to think and feel and remember. The asylum had tried to break her, had subjected her to its regimen of control, and she had bent but not shattered. There was strength in that, a quiet resilience that she had not known she possessed. She thought sometimes about what would happen if she were released, if somehow the doors opened and she found herself on the other side of the walls. Would she know how to live in the outside world? Would she be able to navigate streets she had not walked in years? Talk to people who had not been supervised by attendants? Make decisions for herself without waiting for permission? Or would she stand paralyzed at the gates, unable to take the first step into a freedom she had forgotten how to use? These thoughts came mostly at night, in the hours between the evening meal and sleep, when the ward was quiet and there was nothing to do but lie in bed and think. The other patients slept or pretended to sleep, each one alone with her own thoughts, each one inhabiting a private world that no one else could enter. Eleanor lay awake and wondered about her future, about whether she had one, about what shape it might take if it ever arrived. Asterisk, asterisk, visiting day came once a month. On a Sunday afternoon, when the asylum opened its doors to families and friends who wished to see patients. The visiting room was a large parlor in the main building, furnished with chairs and tables and decorated with plants and pictures meant to suggest domestic comfort. Patients who were well enough to receive visitors were brought to this room, dressed in their best clothes, reminded of the rules. No discussion of treatment. No requests for discharge. No scenes. Asterisk for some patients. Visiting day was the high point of the month, a precious connection to the lives they had left behind. Families came with news and gifts, with photographs of children growing up, with reassurances that they had not been forgotten. The visits were short, usually an hour at most, and heavily supervised, but they were moments of normalcy in an abnormal world, glimpses of the people the patients had been and might still become. For other patients, visiting day was a torment. Some had no visitors, no one who cared enough to make the journey, no one who wanted to see them in their reduced state. They watched as other patients received their families, and the watching was worse than anything the asylum could do to them. Some had visitors who came out of obligation rather than love, who sat in uncomfortable silence or filled the air with chatter that meant nothing. Some had visitors who reproached them, who demanded improvement, who threatened to stop coming if things did not change. Eleanor's family visited regularly at first, her father and her younger sister making the journey from London every few weeks. The visits were awkward, full of silences and forced conversation, but Eleanor treasured them nonetheless. Then her mother died, and her father's health began to fail, and the visits grew less frequent. Her sister married and moved away, and the visits stopped altogether. By her 4th year in the asylum, Eleanor had not seen a family member in over a year. She was still their daughter, their sister, but she had become something abstract, someone they preferred not to think about. Asterisk letters were the other connection to the outside world, though they too were regulated and supervised. Patients could write to their families, but the letters were read by staff before being sent, and anything deemed inappropriate was censored or withheld. Families could write to patients, but these letters too were screened, and news that might upset the patient was sometimes kept from them entirely. Eleanor wrote regularly at first, long letters describing her daily life, her hopes for recovery, her longing to return home. The letters grew shorter over the years, as she ran out of things to say, and as she began to suspect that they made no difference. Her father wrote back, brief notes that said little and promised nothing. After his death, which occurred in her 5th year of confinement, even these notes stopped coming. Some patients received no letters at all, had no one to write to them, had been so thoroughly abandoned that they might as well have ceased to exist as far as the outside world was concerned. These patients lived entirely within the asylum's walls, their only human connections the other patients and the staff who controlled them. They had no news from outside, no reminders of another life, nothing to anchor them to any identity beyond their status as inmates. The asylum library subscribed to several newspapers, and patients who demonstrated responsible behavior were allowed to read them under supervision. The newspapers were a window to the outside world, a reminder that things were happening beyond the walls, that life continued in its endless variety, even for those who could not participate in it. Eleanor read the newspapers whenever she could, following the news of politics and society, of wars and scandals, of scientific advances and social changes. She read about the reforms to the asylum system, the new laws that were meant to protect patients' rights, the debates about how the mad should be treated. She read about the world that had continued without her, the world she could see only through the medium of newsprint and ink. The newspapers told her that time was passing, that the world was changing, that the year she had entered the asylum was receding into history while new years took its place. They told her that there was still a world out there, beyond the walls and the gates and the iron bars, a world where people came and went as they pleased, where no one held the keys to their movements, where they were free. The newspapers were a comfort and a torment, a connection and a reminder of how much she had lost. Escape was the dream of every patient, or nearly every patient, in the asylum. The walls and locks and bars were constant reminders of confinement, constant provocations to the human desire for freedom. Some patients thought of nothing else, spent their days studying the layout of the building, the routines of the attendants, the weaknesses in the security that might be exploited. Others had given up, had accepted their imprisonment as permanent, had lost even the capacity to imagine life on the other side of the gates. The attempts came regularly, 1 or 2 a month, usually foiled within minutes or hours. A patient might slip away during outdoor exercise, might hide in a storage room until nightfall, might overpower an attendant and take her keys. The alarm would be raised, the asylum would go into lockdown, and search parties would fan out across the grounds and into the surrounding countryside. Almost always, the escapee was found and returned, and almost always, there were consequences. The punishments for attempted escape were severe. Days in the padded cell, where the patient was confined in complete isolation with nothing but the walls and the floor and her own thoughts. Increased security, with the patient moved to a more restricted ward and subjected to closer supervision. Loss of privileges, whatever small freedoms the patient had earned through good behavior. And always, the note in the case file that would follow the patient for as long as she remained in the system, marking her as a risk, a troublemaker, someone who could not be trusted. Yet still they tried, driven by desperation or delusion, or simply the refusal to accept that this was all there would ever be. Some planned carefully, waiting for the perfect moment, gathering information over months or years. Others acted on impulse, seizing an opportunity that presented itself without warning. A few succeeded, at least temporarily, making it beyond the walls and into the world, before they were recaptured or gave themselves up or simply collapsed under the weight of their illnesses. The stories of successful escapes circulated through the asylum like legends, told and retold until fact and fiction became impossible to separate. There was the man who had hidden in a delivery wagon and ridden out the main gate in broad daylight, not discovered until the wagon was miles away. There was the woman who had stolen an attendant's uniform and walked out the front door, her demeanor so calm and confident that no one thought to question her. There was the patient who had climbed the wall in a thunderstorm, the noise of the rain covering his movements, and had never been seen again. Some stories were darker. The patient who had escaped only to be found dead days later, lost in the countryside, unable to survive without the institution that had imprisoned her. The patient who had made it home to his family, only to be recommitted within a week, his escape changing nothing. The patient who had disappeared and was presumed dead, though no body was ever found. Her fate a mystery that the asylum preferred not to investigate too closely. Eleanor listened to these stories and dreamed her own dreams of escape. She studied the locks and the windows, the routines and the gaps in supervision. She imagined herself on the other side of the walls, free to go where she pleased, to live as she chose, to be something other than a patient. But she never attempted it, never took the risk, never tested the walls that held her. She was afraid of the punishment, yes, but more than that, she was afraid of what she would find on the other side. The world had moved on without her. Where would she go? Who would take her in? What would she do? Asterisk, not all departures were escapes. Some patients were discharged, officially released by the doctors who had committed them, returned to families who were willing to take them back. The process was slow and uncertain, requiring evidence of recovery that the doctors defined and the patients could only try to provide. Good behavior, compliance with treatment, improvement in symptoms, the ability to work and to interact appropriately with others. All these were considered, weighed, evaluated by men who held absolute power over the patients. Futures. Eleanor watched others leave and wondered why she could not. She had recovered from the depression that had brought her to the asylum, or so she believed. She worked diligently, followed the rules, caused no trouble. She wrote to her family, asking them to apply for her release, but the letters brought no response. She spoke to the doctors during their rounds, tried to convince them that she was ready to leave, but they only nodded and made notes and moved on to the next patient. The truth was that recovery alone was not enough. Patients needed somewhere to go, someone to take responsibility for them, a life on the outside that was waiting for them to return to. Eleanor's father was dead, her sister distant, her place in the world uncertain. The asylum might have been willing to release her, but there was no one to release her to. And so she remained year after year, not because she was ill, but because she had no other option, a prisoner of circumstances as much as of locks and walls. Death was a constant presence in the asylum, as common as the meals and the bells and the endless routine. Patients died of the illnesses that had brought them to the asylum, or of the complications of treatment, or of the conditions of their confinement. They died of tuberculosis, which spread easily in the crowded wards. They died of pneumonia, which struck those weakened by poor nutrition and inadequate heating. They died of heart failure and stroke, and the thousand other ways that bodies give out when the will to live has faded. The dying was not always visible. Patients who were near death were moved to the infirmary, a separate ward where they could receive more intensive care, and where their decline would not disturb the other patients. The deaths occurred behind closed doors, attended by nurses and perhaps by a doctor, rarely by family members who could not or would not come. The body was washed and dressed and placed in a coffin, and a brief service was held in the asylum chapel before burial. Some deaths were more violent. Patients killed themselves despite the attendants' vigilance, finding ways to end their lives that no one out of supervision could prevent. They hanged themselves with strips of bedding, cut themselves with stolen implements, threw themselves from windows that were supposed to be unbreakable. Each suicide prompted an investigation, a report to the commissioners. Promises of improved security that never quite prevented the next one. And some deaths were caused by the institution itself, by treatments that went wrong, by restraints applied too tightly, by medications given in doses that proved fatal. These deaths were recorded as natural causes or as complications of the patient's underlying condition, and no one was held responsible. The asylum was meant to heal, but it also killed, and the killing was wrapped in the language of medicine and care. The asylum cemetery lay beyond the main buildings, a quiet acre of ground surrounded by a low stone wall. Here the patients who died without families to claim them were buried, their graves marked with simple stones bearing only numbers and dates. The numbered stones stretched in neat rows, hundreds of them, a city of the dead that mirrored the city of the living in the wards. Above, some patients had families who wanted their bodies returned, who paid for proper funerals and burial in churchyards among the respectable dead. But many did not, had no one to claim them, had been abandoned so thoroughly that even their deaths went unnoticed by those who had once known them. These patients were buried by the asylum, in graves dug by other patients, with services conducted by the asylum chaplain for congregations that consisted only of staff. The cemetery was visible from some of the ward windows, a reminder to the living of what awaited them if they did not recover, if they did not leave, if they remained in the asylum until the end. Patients looked out at the stones and wondered which number would be theirs, which plot of ground would hold their bodies when the struggle was finally over. The cemetery was the final destination, the end of the journey that had begun with the carriage ride through the gates. Eleanor visited the cemetery once, on a spring afternoon when her work detail was assigned to tend the grounds. She walked among the stones, reading the numbers and dates, trying to imagine the people who lay beneath. Some had been in the asylum for decades, their stones weathered and moss-covered. Others were recent, the earth still raw over their graves. All of them had been someone once, had had names and families and lives. Now they were only numbers, forgotten by everyone except the institution that had confined them. She stopped before one grave that drew her attention, though she could not have said why. The stone was small, the number barely legible after years of weathering, the dates indicating a life that had lasted only 23 years. Someone had died here at Eleanor's age, had been buried in this ground without ceremony or remembrance, had become nothing more than a number in the asylum's records. Eleanor stood there for a long time, thinking about the woman who lay beneath her feet, wondering what her story had been, what had brought her to the asylum, what had killed her in the end. The attendant supervising the work detail called to her, and she returned to her raking and weeding. But the image of that grave stayed with her. It became a symbol in her mind of what the asylum could do, of the way it could erase a person so completely that nothing remained but a number on a stone. She thought about her own death, about whether she would be buried here, or whether her family would claim her body, about whether anyone would remember her name, or whether she too would become just a number. That night, lying in her bed, she made a silent promise to herself. She would not die here. She would not become another numbered stone in the asylum cemetery. She would survive, whatever it took, whatever she had to endure. She would find a way out, a way back to the world, a way to reclaim the life that had been taken from her. The promise gave her something she had not felt in years, hope, fragile and uncertain, but hope nonetheless. The cemetery appeared in her dreams sometimes, a landscape of numbered stones stretching to the horizon, each one marking a life that the asylum had swallowed. She walked among them in these dreams, reading the numbers, looking for one that bore her own name. She never found it, and she did not know whether this was reassurance or warning. The dreams faded when she woke, but the feeling they left behind lingered through the day, a reminder of what awaited her if she did not find a way to leave. The doctors of the Victorian asylum believed they understood madness, believed they could identify its causes and prescribe its cures. In reality, they were working in almost complete darkness, their theories based on speculation and prejudice rather than scientific evidence. The causes they identified tell us more about Victorian society than about mental illness, reflecting the anxieties and assumptions of an era that was itself undergoing profound change. Heredity was blamed for much of the madness that filled the asylums. Doctors believed that insanity ran in families, that a defect in the blood could be passed from parent to child, that the sins of the fathers were visited upon the sons in the form of mental derangement. Families with a history of mental illness were viewed with suspicion, their children considered at risk, their marriages discouraged lest they produce another generation of the mad. Moral causes were also implicated: excessive emotion, religious fervor, disappointed love, ambition beyond one's station, the strains of modern life in an industrializing society. Women were thought to be particularly vulnerable to emotional causes, their weaker constitutions unable to withstand the stresses that men could bear. Masturbation was considered a major cause of insanity in both sexes, leading to elaborate and sometimes brutal interventions designed to prevent this supposed vice. Physical causes included injury to the head, diseases of the brain, the effects of alcohol and drugs, the complications of childbirth. Syphilis, though the connection was not fully understood, produced a characteristic pattern of mental deterioration that filled entire wards with its victims. Epilepsy was considered a form of insanity. its sufferers confined alongside. The mad though their condition was fundamentally, different. The Victorian doctors classified their patients into categories that seem crude and arbitrary today, but that represented a genuine attempt to bring order to the chaos of mental suffering. Mania and melancholia were the oldest categories, dating back to ancient medicine, describing states of excessive excitement and excessive depression. Dementia referred to the deterioration of mental function, whether from age or disease or injury. Idiocy and imbecility were used for those whose mental development had been impaired from birth. Within these broad categories, subtypes proliferated. There was religious mania and erotic mania, puerperal mania following childbirth, and senile mania in the elderly. There was melancholia with delusions and melancholia without, melancholia with suicidal tendencies, and melancholia that was merely passive. There was moral insanity, which covered behavior that was socially unacceptable without being obviously delusional, and partial insanity, in which the patient was mad on one subject, but rational on all others. The classifications were used to predict outcomes and guide treatment, though they did neither very effectively. Patients with acute mania or melancholia were considered more likely to recover than those with chronic conditions. Patients with dementia were considered incurable, their deterioration inevitable and irreversible. Patients with moral insanity were viewed with suspicion. Their condition, perhaps, not true madness at all, but simply wickedness disguised as disease. Eleanor was classified as suffering from melancholia, later reclassified as recovered, but detained for lack of appropriate discharge arrangements. Her case file, which she was never allowed to see, contained notes from each of the doctors who had examined her over the years, their observations and opinions accumulating into a portrait that she might not have recognized as herself. The file would follow her as long as she remained in the system, a paper version of herself that existed independently of the living woman. The Victorian era saw sustained efforts to reform the treatment of the mentally ill, driven by scandals that periodically erupted when the conditions in asylums became too terrible to ignore. The Lunacy Commission, established in 1845, was charged with overseeing all asylums in England and Wales, visiting them regularly, investigating complaints, and ensuring that patients were treated humanely. The commissioners were men of standing, doctors and lawyers and members of Parliament, who devoted part of their time to inspecting the institutions that housed the mad. They arrived without warning, toured the wards, interviewed patients and staff, examined the records. They wrote reports that were published and debated, that named abuses and demanded reforms, that held superintendents accountable for conditions in their institutions. The commission had real power, the ability to revoke licenses and close institutions that did not meet its standards. But its resources were limited, its visits infrequent, its ability to detect abuse constrained by the cooperation of the very people it was meant to oversee. Superintendents prepared for inspections, cleaned up the wards, hid the evidence of the worst practices, presented their best patients and their best behavior. The commissioners saw what they were shown, and what they were shown was not always the truth. Still, the commission made a difference. The worst abuses of the early 19th century, the chains and the darkness and the starvation, were largely eliminated under its watch. Standards of care improved, if slowly and unevenly. Patients gained at least the theoretical right to communicate with the outside world, to complain about their treatment, to be heard by someone other than their keepers. The asylum remained a fearsome place, but it was less fearsome than it had been. The most powerful advocates for reform were sometimes the patients themselves, those who had experienced the asylum from the inside and who found ways to tell their stories to the world. Some wrote memoirs after their release, accounts of their confinement that shocked readers and prompted demands for change. Others wrote while still confined, smuggling out letters and manuscripts that described conditions the asylum authorities would have preferred to keep hidden. These patient narratives challenged the authority of the doctors and the assumptions of the public. They insisted that patients were human beings deserving of dignity and respect, not merely cases to be classified and treated. They described the terror of confinement, the degradation of the treatments, the despair of being held without hope of release. They gave voice to the voiceless, speaking for the thousands who could not speak for themselves. Not all patient narratives were reliable, of course. Some patients were genuinely delusional, their accounts of abuse reflecting their illnesses rather than reality. Doctors used this to dismiss patient complaints, to argue that no testimony from a lunatic could be trusted, that the very act of complaining was evidence of continued madness. It was a convenient argument, one that silenced criticism and protected the institution from scrutiny. Eleanor had no voice in these debates, no way to tell her story to those who might have helped her. She was not a writer, had no connections to journalists or reformers, had no platform from which to speak. She could only endure, year after year, waiting for a change that might never come. Her story would be told only in the case files that recorded her symptoms and her treatments. The official version that left out everything that mattered in the 7th year of Eleanor's confinement. Something changed. Her sister, long silent, wrote to the asylum inquiring about the possibility of discharge. The sister had settled into her new life, had a home large enough to accommodate another person, had come to feel guilty about the abandonment that had left Eleanor to rot in the institution. The letter asked what would be required to secure Eleanor's release. The doctors considered the request. Eleanor's case file showed no recent incidents, no signs of active illness, no behavior that would justify continued confinement. She had been a model patient for years, compliant and hardworking, causing no trouble. The original diagnosis of melancholia had long since been changed to recovered, and the only reason she remained was the lack of a suitable discharge plan. Now such a plan was being offered. The superintendent interviewed Eleanor, the first time they had spoken at length in years. He asked her about her plans, her expectations, her understanding of her condition. He warned her that the transition to life outside would be difficult, that she had been institutionalized for a long time, that she might struggle to adapt. He asked if she was willing to live with her sister, to follow whatever rules her sister imposed, to seek help if she felt herself becoming unwell again. Eleanor answered carefully, aware that her future depended on saying the right things. She said she was grateful for her sister's offer, that she would do whatever was required, that she understood the challenges she would face. She did not say what she was thinking, which was that 7 years of her life had been taken from her, that she had lost her youth and her prospects and her place in the world, that nothing could ever make up for what had been done to her. The discharge papers were signed on a Tuesday morning in October, almost exactly 7 years after Eleanor's admission. She was given back her own clothes, which had been stored all this time and which no longer fit her changed body. She was given her few possessions, the portrait of her mother, and the letters she had received, artifacts of a life that seemed to belong to someone else. She was given a small amount of money, enough for the train fare to her sister's home. Mrs. Briggs walked her to the front gate, the same gate she had entered 7 years before. The attendant's face was expressionless, professional, betraying nothing of what she might be feeling. She unlocked the gate and held it open, and Eleanor stepped through, and the gate closed behind her with a sound that was both final and utterly anticlimactic. The world outside was overwhelming. The sounds of traffic and voices, the movement of people going about their business, the simple fact of being able to walk in any direction without permission or supervision. Eleanor stood on the pavement outside the asylum walls and did not know where to go. Her sister would meet her at the train station in London, but first she had to get there, had to navigate a world she no longer understood. She walked slowly, uncertainly, toward the town. People passed her without looking, wrapped up in their own lives, unaware that the woman walking among them had just emerged from 7 years of confinement. She was invisible, anonymous, free in ways she had almost forgotten how to be. The asylum receded behind her, its gray bulk growing smaller with each step, until finally she turned the corner and could no longer see it at all. The town was overwhelming in its ordinariness. Shops lined the street, their windows filled with goods she had not seen in years. People hurried past on errands she could only guess at, their faces absorbed in concerns that had nothing to do with the asylum on the hill. A dog trotted by, sniffing at the pavement. Children played in an alley, their laughter sharp and bright. Everything was moving, changing, alive in ways the asylum had never been. She found a tea shop and went in, driven by a need to sit down, to gather herself, to delay the journey ahead. The woman behind the counter looked at her strangely, perhaps noticing something in her manner or her dress that marked her as different. Eleanor ordered tea and a biscuit, using coins that felt strange in her hand after so long without money of her own. The tea was strong and sweet, nothing like the weak brew served in the asylum, and she drank it slowly, savoring each sip. Through the window, she watched the life of the town continue. A woman walked by with a basket of flowers. 2 men stood on the corner, deep in conversation. A horse-drawn cart clattered past, loaded with barrels. These were the ordinary scenes of ordinary life, the life she had been excluded from for 7 years. They seemed both familiar and utterly alien. A world she remembered, but no longer quite belonged to. The train station was a short walk from the tea shop, and she made her way there as the afternoon began to fade. The station was busy with travelers, people going about their business, catching trains to destinations across the country. Eleanor bought her ticket and found a seat on the platform, waiting for the train that would carry her to London, to her sister, to whatever came next. The train arrived with a rush of steam and noise, and Eleanor boarded with the other passengers. She found a seat by the window and watched as the station receded, as the town gave way to countryside, as the world she had known for 7 years disappeared behind her. She was leaving, really leaving, and the reality of it washed over her in waves of relief and terror. She pressed her forehead to the cool glass of the window and let the tears come, tears she had held back for so long that she had almost forgotten how to cry. The adjustment to life outside was everything the superintendent had warned her it would be. Eleanor lived with her sister's family, but she did not fit. She had lost the ability to make small talk. to participate in the ordinary rituals of domestic life, to be the person her sister remembered. She was too quiet, too watchful, too strange. The children were afraid of her, and her brother-in-law was uncomfortable in her presence. She took a position as a seamstress, work that allowed her to sit quietly and use her hands without having to interact much with others. She earned enough to contribute to the household, to feel that she was not entirely a burden. She attended church on Sundays and took walks in the park and tried to rebuild a life from the pieces that remained. The asylum never fully left her. She dreamed of it, the long corridors and the locked doors and the faces of patients she had known. She flinched at sudden sounds, at the jangling of keys, at voices raised in anger. She could not bear to be confined in small spaces, could not tolerate anyone telling her what to do. The institution had shaped her in ways that 7 years of freedom could not erase. She never married, never had children, never achieved the life that might have been hers if the melancholia had not struck, and the doctors had not come, and the carriage had not carried her through those iron gates. She lived to be 63, dying in her sister's home of a heart that simply gave out one night as she slept. She was buried in a churchyard, not in an asylum cemetery, with a headstone that bore her name rather than a number. It was a small victory, but it was hers in her final years. Eleanor sometimes spoke of the asylum to her sister's children, now grown with children of their own. She told them about the women she had known, about Margaret and Alice and Helena, about the attendants and the doctors and the endless routines. She told them about the cold baths and the restraints, about the food and the work, about the long afternoons in the day room, watching the world through barred windows. She wanted them to know, wanted someone to remember, wanted the story to survive even after she was gone. She kept a journal in those final years, writing down her memories while she still could, while the details were still clear in her mind. The journal was found after her death, a small leather-bound book filled with her careful handwriting, a record of 7 years that the asylum had tried to erase. Her great-niece kept the journal, passed it down through the family, and eventually donated it to a museum that collected artifacts from the history of the Heights, from the history of mental health care. The journal is still there today, in a glass case in a room dedicated to the Victorian Asylum. Visitors can see Eleanor's handwriting, can read her words, can glimpse the world she inhabited through her eyes. Her name is on a small card beside the case, along with the dates of her life and a brief description of her story. She is remembered, after all, not as a number but as a person, not as a case but as a human being who survived. The Victorian Asylum has passed into history, its great buildings repurposed or demolished, its patients released into communities that were often unprepared to receive them. The reforms of the 20th century closed the institutions that had housed hundreds of thousands, replacing them with community care and psychiatric hospitals and medications that could control symptoms without walls or locks. But the legacy of the asylum remains. The buildings themselves, where they survive, stand as monuments to an era that believed it could cure madness through architecture and routine, that thought it understood the mysteries of the human mind, when in fact it was only beginning to ask the right questions. Some have become museums, inviting visitors to walk the corridors and peer into the cells where patients once lived and died. Others have been converted to apartments or offices, their dark history papered over but not erased, The practices of the Victorian asylum have been rejected, condemned, held up as examples of how not to treat the mentally ill. The restraints and the cold baths, the isolation and the overcrowding, the assumption that the mad had no rights worthy of respect. All these have been repudiated by modern psychiatry, which claims to offer something better, something more humane. Yet the questions the asylum raised have not been fully answered. What do we owe to those whose minds work differently from our own? How do we balance the freedom of the individual against the safety of the community? When does treatment become imprisonment, care become control, help become harm? These questions haunted the Victorian asylum, and they haunt us still. The patients remembered. The patients of the Victorian asylum are mostly forgotten. Their names lost, their stories untold, their suffering unremembered, except in the archives that recorded their symptoms and their treatments. They were daughters and sons, mothers and fathers, people who had lived and loved and struggled before the asylum swallowed them whole. They deserved better than they received. Some, like Eleanor Blackwood, found their way back to the world, scarred but surviving, carrying the weight of their experience into lives that continued despite everything. Others died in the institution, their graves marked with numbers, their identities erased by the system that was supposed to help them. Still others live on only in case files and admission records, their humanity reduced to diagnoses and treatment notes. Tonight, as you lie in the darkness listening to this story, remember them. Remember that they were real, that they suffered, that they hoped for rescue that often never came. Remember that the history of mental illness is a history of human beings trying to understand and help one another. Sometimes succeeding, often failing, always struggling against mysteries that remain beyond our full comprehension. And now, dear listener, as this long journey draws to its close, let us observe a moment of silence for those who passed through the asylum gates and did not return. For Eleanor Blackwood and Margaret and Alice and all the others, named and unnamed, remembered and forgotten. For the doctors who tried to heal and the attendants who kept order and the reformers who demanded change. For everyone who has struggled with the darkness of the mind in the Victorian era and in our own. The night is quiet now. The asylum is closed, its wards empty, its gates standing open to a world that has moved on. The patients are at rest, their suffering ended, their stories waiting to be told. And you, dear listener, are safe in your bed, free to come and go as you please, free to seek help if you need it, free in ways that the patients of the asylum could only dream of. Sleep now. Let the story fade as the night deepens. Let the images of the asylum dissolve into the darkness. Let your mind rest, knowing that the morning will come, that the gates will not close behind you, that you will wake to a world that, for all its troubles, has learned something from the suffering of the past. The night archivist watches over you. The night passes. The morning comes. Rest. Well. Thank you for listening to the Night Archivist. If you enjoyed this journey through history, please subscribe and leave a comment telling me where you listened from tonight. Until next time, sleep well.